He's coming directly from Germany to us to share his wisdom and expertise with our global community. And I'm talking about Sean MacNiven. Sean, please do join us here. Sean is the global lead for strategy and research for SAP's Global Product Support Organization. With over 15 years of experience at SAP and as an independent consultant to organizations and government, including the European Commission. Among the topics he leads, he is the chief architect of the support organization's strategy of minimizing effort for employees and customers through the automation of insights and the digital augmentation of knowledge workers. Subtopics of his expertise also include the design of adaptive systems, gamifications, measurement, research design, communications, and PR impact, and social influence in online environments. And today he's going to be talking to us about performance anxiety, how to define and measure what really matters. Sean, this is a fascinating topic. On behalf of our global community, we're very thankful for you to share your wisdom and expertise with all of us today.
Thanks a lot, Jose. So to get started, let me just share my screen. Everyone can see that, hopefully. And I'll put myself away so I can't see myself. So thank you for that, Jose. I sound a lot more impressive than I probably am. Performance anxiety, something that we often deal with in the enterprise, and the topic of measurement. So I'd like to just get started with a question for you. So before I skew any of your results, I'd just like to ask you in general, do you think that the metrics you're measured by make sense? And Jose, if you can just run that poll now, very briefly, to get a sense of where people feel they're at in their organizations, that would be very helpful.
And I have just launched the poll, Sean. So for all of those attending, please go ahead and take your votes. Do you think the metrics you're measured by make sense? It's a simple yes or no. So choose one of those two options. Go ahead and vote now. And I'm going to be watching your voting coming in here. Take your votes. Do you think the metrics you're measured by make sense? Go ahead and vote yes or no. Do they make sense to you? Yes or no? I'm seeing your votes coming in. We have about a third of the votes in. We're approaching a half of the votes in. Good job, everyone. Keep going, keep going. This is an interesting audience, business transformation, operational excellence leaders. I'm curious to see if you feel that the metrics you're measured by make sense. All right, I'm gonna cap it now for those who voted. Thank you very much. I'm closing in here. And Sean, I'm going to share the results of the poll now. And what we had, Sean, is that 67% of the people said yes, they think it makes sense, but 33% said no, it doesn't make sense.
Interesting, interesting. I kind of expected a bit of a 50-50, but that's very interesting. Maybe that's a good sign as well. But thank you for that. That's really just to sort of set the scene for the overall topic that we're looking at and some of the challenges faced. So the agenda for today is to talk about just going through a couple of examples of meaningless metrics, then the human factor of why we may adhere to metrics or set metrics that don't necessarily make sense, or make decisions that don't necessarily make sense. Then when KPIs are not necessarily the right metric to use, the topic of framing failure as something positive, and then just a couple of steps towards meaningful measurement. So without further ado, we'll start off with some meaningless metrics. Now, if you're in the marketing communications area, one of those will be hits. And I like this. For many years, I worked in the communications department of SAP and led innovation for that department. And when I joined it, they were always talking about hits and views and page views and all the rest. And I encountered the acronym that hits actually means how idiots track success. So the problem with hits and the similarly related topic of impressions now with social media, which is even less tangible than hits in the sense that impressions don't even measure actual clicks, they actually just measure potential clicks. So someone may have seen or may have viewed your content. This insanity about these metrics is that they're big metrics and they seem to be impressive and they're very, very easy to capture, but they don't actually translate directly to impact unless the sheer number of hits is your impact metric, but it rarely is. They can be give you a sense of scale, but that's about the extent of it. Another one is adoption. So platform adoption. Now, adoption itself is not a meaningless metric, but the way it's often measured, is very frequently quite meaningless. The number of times that people log into a system. Like with any metric, you need to really go into more detail about, is it the amount of time that they're spending? What are they actually clicking through? What is the customer journey or the engineer journey or whatever happens to be your target audience? What are they doing within that time? Adoption is not just a matter of that they use the system on occasions. You have to go a lot further into it. But adoption is one of these things, and you'll see later on one of my SAP examples, that can really lead to the wrong incentives as well. Another similarly related topic is activity. And again, activity, whether it's clicks or views or ratings of content or whatever it happens to be, which is closely engaged, connected to engagement as well. In itself, nice to know, but not necessarily connected to impact. And that's what we often struggle with, is that we have these metrics like adoption, and activity, and hits, but they are completely liberated from any connection to actual business impact. This also goes to the academic world as well, where the number of citations is a big factor about the extent to which a journal article or a piece of published research is viewed as positive or impactful, simply the number of times that other people have cited it. And to the extent that it goes to the so-called impact factor, which has almost terrorized the academic world, because the impact factor, if your university has a high impact factor in terms of the published research, you're more likely to get government funding and all the rest. And yet the impact factor itself has been heavily criticized by researchers because of its skew, and also it doesn't look at the quality of the source of citations. Good journals tend to have higher numbers of citations, but it's a poor indicator of the individual quality of the papers published in those journals. And some open source publications are just as good as Science or Nature or Cell or any of the really top journals in terms of the quality of the individual publications themselves. So again, metrics that can be quite meaningless, but can have a major impact, negative impact. Within the support world, and this is what I was kind of alluding to before, another topic is also the topic of deflection. So deflection is basically any kind of technology or tactics or processes that enable you to not have to have a customer engage with your support staff. And it's not because we don't like our customers, but it's because ideally we'd like our customers to solve the problem themselves, because that's the lowest time to resolution and is most likely going to be the highest satisfaction levels for them and the lowest amount of effort if they can just find a solution very, very quickly and never have to engage with support staff. But again, how you measure deflection is not really standardized across the industry. And I recently presented at the TSIA, the Technology and Service Industry Association, around the same topic, and having engaged with some of their experts across the consortium, the topic of deflection is not well defined anywhere by any company, and yet it's one of the most fundamental metrics that a support organization is measured by. So we, for a time at SAP, had the metric of like this 50-50 slogan. It's always good to have slogans when you're in a corporation. So we had this 50-50 2020 goal of reducing ticket volume by 50%. And that literally meant the number of tickets, reducing them by 50%. But when you actually then look at the distribution in terms of the time it takes, and this is taken from a sample of 350,000 tickets that I analyzed specifically for this talk here, the solve time of the lower 50% of tickets in terms of the number of days it takes to solve tickets versus the upper group, basically when you divide it that way, if you take the lower 50%, you're only deflecting or reducing or minimizing effort by around 4% for your organization, because the upper 50% of tickets take up 96% of the time. It's like the Pareto principle, the 80-20 principle. But even worse, this is a 496 principle. So the easiest 50% of tickets represent 4% of the total effort. Poor metric if you're incentivizing people and giving the impression that we've now reduced ticket volume by 50%. No, you haven't. You've reduced it by 4%. This is an example then of low-hanging fruit as well. We often talk about that, and we'll often choose metrics because they may be easily accessible. Maybe we have them in the database already. Another big challenge in corporations of any size, I guess, is obtaining accurate data. especially if you have a larger organization or a complex IT landscape, then you're going to have many systems that may be storing data in slightly different ways that lead to translation issues and harmonization issues when you're bringing the data together. And we've struggled with this a great deal, especially leading research topics for SAP. The amount of effort you need to invest just to get the right data can be prohibitive at times. And the problem with low-hanging fruit is that you often get a little more than you bargained for, and the low-hanging fruit is also the most likely to fall to the ground. I actually calculated this 500% extra protein because the average earthworm, and I know that earthworms don't eat fruit, but I mean it's apples, but the average earthworm has about 1.9 grams of protein, which is around 6 times higher than the amount of protein in an apple. Trivia. So this is nicely summarized by the topic of Campbell's law, and I've paraphrased this, it's been paraphrased many times, but basically, when you take a simple indicator, any kind of quantitative indicator, and you make that the foundation for your decisions, it becomes less and less reliable as an indicator. And it seems kind of challenging in that sense that you have this indicator and you're trying to use it, but you're actually inspiring certain behaviors around it. And one of them is that people will try to game the system. So if there is a metric and I have to meet that metric, then I'm going to do everything in my power to game that system, or I'll simply adjust my behaviors to match what is expected of me, irrespective of whether that metric actually makes sense and is actually connected to corporate impact. So that leads us then to the human factor. Yes, you and me and all of us here. And that will lead us to another poll as well. The poll is, are you a better than average driver? Jose, if you could run that poll, this would be interesting to see.
This will be interesting to see with this audience. Are you better than an average driver? So I'm launching the poll right now, and you should be seeing that come up momentarily. So please go ahead and vote. You have 2 options here. Are you better than an average driver? Yes or no. Click one of those 2 options, and I'm gonna wait for your votes to come in. So please go ahead and vote. Are you better than an average driver? Take your votes. I'm waiting for them to come in. So a few votes coming in already. We have 40% of you voting right now. Keep going. Awesome. Let's see what it looks like. Keep going. I'm going to give you 5 more seconds to make up your mind here. Are you better than an average driver or not? So I'm going to close it now, and I'm going to share the results with everybody. And what do you know? Pareto's law again prevails. 80% of us thinks that we're better than the average driver.
And that is supported by research. Now, probably we have a global audience here, but already around 40 years ago, or 40 years this year actually, anniversary, a study was run in the US and Sweden that found that 93% of the US audience and 69% of the Swedish audience put themselves in the top 50%. So this may seem like an example of overconfidence. How is it possible that 80% of us can be better, can be in the top 50%? Obviously, it doesn't really make sense from a logical rationality perspective. Interestingly, it does make sense from an ecologically rational perspective, because ecologically, most drivers are better than average, and it's probably around 80 to 90% are better than average because it's negatively skewed. So what you actually do have is that there are some really, really bad drivers, and they skew to the left, and probably 70 to 80% are better than average, but obviously not better than median. And when people think of this, they typically think of themselves in the median perspective. But it is an example also of overconfidence, and that is one of the big challenges that we face in organizations and in life in general when making decisions, but especially as we start to deal with leaders or decision makers and executives. And this can be reinforced. The more experience you have and the more successes you have, then the more likely you are to think that your decisions are going to be correct. And then we have also the Dunning-Kruger effect, one of my favorites, which is basically the less you know, the more confident you are. And I think we've seen a lot of this in many of the conversations since 2016 with Brexit and the US elections. A lot of conversations have happened on both sides where we found the Dunning-Kruger effect very effective. So I have another question for you, and that is, which city has more inhabitants, Geneva or Thun? Thun, however it's pronounced. Any Swiss people can correct me. Jose, could you run this poll now quickly? And thank you guys so much for your engagement.
Right now. Which city has the most inhabitants, Geneva or Thun? Please take one of your votes. Take a vote here. One of two options here. The poll is now open. Vote for the city that has the most inhabitants in your opinion. Choose one out of the two. Don't overthink this. Just go with what you know. Which city has the most inhabitants? Waiting for the votes to come in. They are coming in. Very well. Keep going. Well done. We have votes coming in. And we have it right now. I'm closing right now and I'm sharing the results. And what we have is that Geneva has 53% of the votes for most inhabitants and Thun has 47%. Sean?
Yes, thank you for that. I think that the topic of cognitive biases and overconfidence has probably skewed this somewhat, which I expected. But actually, Geneva does have more inhabitants, and it's many, many, many more inhabitants than Thun. And this is an example of the take the best heuristic. So it's not always biases that biases are negative, or the way that we think is not always negative. It really depends on the context in which we're thinking and the context in which we have to make our decisions. The take the best heuristic, which also includes less is more. Sometimes knowing less about a particular topic makes you more accurate. Recognition heuristic is this here. Most people recognize the name Geneva, but don't recognize the name Thun. And it's another example of one reason decision making. It's been very effective with predicting elections based on single topics, the size of sporting organizations, etc. And in fact, as I've stated here, and there's the research you can see here as well, it often outperforms even machine learning methods like logistic regression and various classification algorithms. But at the same time, it is closely related to what's known as the availability heuristic. And that can lead to other types of biases as well, in the sense that if you've heard of something before, then you're more likely to give it more weight than if you have not heard of it before. And this applies to anything that's happening in the media. So what the media reports or your social media feeds report is top of mind basically, and it's going to have an influence. It's going to bias your decisions. And so you may be the person that knows the true truth as compared to the fake truth. So what's actually going on in the world as compared to what we hear and what's reported can then be the availability heuristic. And a final poll for you, and I'll just read this out and then ask Jose to run the poll. Steve is very shy and withdrawn, invariably helpful, but with very little interest in people or in the world of reality. A meek and tidy soul, he has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. Is Steve more likely to be a librarian or a farmer? Jose, if you can run that poll, that would be great.
So the poll is getting launched right now. Is Steve a farmer or librarian? So please vote for one of the two options, farmer or librarian. Waiting for your votes to come in. Go ahead and take your votes. Is Steve a farmer or a librarian based on the description that you have just seen? Go ahead and vote. Very well. First few votes are starting to come in. Great. Well done. Keep on voting. I'll give you another 15 seconds or so to cast your vote. And coming in. Well done. I'm gonna close at this point.
Great.
And the results are 56% think that Steve is a farmer and 44% thinks he's a librarian.
Interesting. So the point would be now what your reason for choosing one or the other is, because the results are such that there are 55 times more male farmers in the US alone than there are male librarians. So based purely on the statistics, the probability of Steve being a farmer, irrespective of any descriptions of Steve's nature, is that the base rate is 55 times higher than him being a male librarian. And if that's the reason that you chose pharma, then congratulations, you're probably in the top 1% of the world for getting that right for the right reason. If you were basing it on, well, maybe Sean is asking me this question, it's a trick question, so I'm going to go counterintuitively. Sounds like a librarian, but that can't be right. That would be the correct answer, but the wrong reason. And vice versa, if you chose the aspect of the personality being a librarian, any argument other than the statistical probability itself would probably have been the wrong reason to choose one or the other. In any case, this is known as the base rate fallacy, and it's that when we're making decisions, we often fail to take into account the fundamental probability of a given situation. If you look at any sort of Bayesian theories, etc., Bayes' law states that very clearly. You're constantly updating your probabilities, but you need to have that initial fundamental probability to start with. So congrats to anyone that got that right for the right reason. I, by the way, was not among those people when I encountered that question. So I think I chose pharma, but for the wrong reasons. Another aspect that we often encounter is the anchoring effect. And that basically is that whatever number we hear first tends to stick in our minds more frequently and have more weight. So I would have run this as a poll, but I can't because I'd need to run it with two separate groups and give you both groups two separate numbers and then ask you to estimate. But if we look at this very simple one from Kahneman here, that when two groups were asked to estimate the number, the sum of 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 to 8, and the other half got 8 times 7 times 6, etc. to 1, the estimate for the lower was 512, and the estimate for the higher one was 2,250. And the correct answer was 40,320, so much higher again. But it clearly shows that the anchoring effect is powerful. And the other aspect of the anchoring effect is that it's extremely difficult to debias. It's so fundamental that even when given monetary remuneration, people, and they know that they're being anchored, we struggle as humans to deal with the anchoring effect. So a very, very insidious and pervasive bias that will skew any of our decisions. The other is a framing effect as well, is that depending on whether you say 1% fat or 99% fat-free, will have a major impact on your purchasing behaviors as well. So the way that we frame numbers makes a huge difference. A lot of research has been done into like medical decisions, and that was also in one of the courses I took, saying that you have a 10% chance of dying versus a 90% chance of living will skew the patient's decisions about given treatments. And the one that relates to the pharma question is the outcome bias. And this is a really, really powerful one. It's really the one that I've worked the most against, I guess, or at debiasing within my own company of SAP, is that we often think about the results of a given project rather than the process that led us to those results. So that's the question with the pharma. Did you choose pharma of those 47%? Did you choose it for the right reason? Because if not, you might think, I got that right, pat on the shoulder, and the next time you're faced with such a question, you'll use the same heuristics and the same strategy, and next time it might not work out. So this is a process about really understanding why we make certain decisions. Is very fundamental to how we set metrics and measurement. And another one is the confirmation bias. I drew this comic when I was actually doing my doctoral work, so it was inspired by the research world. We're not sure whether the data would support our hypothesis until we remove the outliers. We look for information that confirms our existing beliefs, and we do it mostly unconsciously. We're happy to hear something like the availability heuristic. Oh, I've heard that before, and so it must be correct because I've heard it before. That confirms my existing beliefs, so it's probably correct, and we'll have a bias and tend to favor those types of information that confirm our existing biases. And to summarize that, there's a fantastic document here called the Cognitive Bias Codex. I highly recommend you download it. There's an SVG file of it, so you can print it up, and pin it to your wall. You can make it your wall to remind you if you like. I've been thinking about doing that actually. They tried to capture pretty much every bias there is, and they've grouped it beautifully. But what this all tells us is that basically, we are fundamentally human and biased. We can debias some of these aspects. So motivational biases are biases that we're motivated to hold because we've committed to something. Perhaps we've committed to a project deadline or whatever else. This can be debiased by basically asking people to calculate more, spend more time thinking about the problems. or to hold them accountable for it. The cognitive biases that we saw before with the codex, there are so many different techniques. Even anchoring can be have its effect minimized with re-anchoring techniques. And overconfidence, there are many strategies for minimizing the negative impacts of overconfidence, such as just considering the opposite scenario, or running what's called a client's pre-mortem, where you basically, before you run a project, you think about all the reasons why it's failed. So you imagine that it's failed, and then you work through all the reasons why it failed, and then make sure that those things don't happen when you actually run the project. It's a very powerful technique as well. These are both limited in the sense that they're typically individual debiasing techniques. There are technologies. I won't present that in this conference, but I'm actually building a massive choice architecture platform basically within SAP for support, to enable support engineers to debias through the system itself. So basically making it easy to make the right decisions. But that's for another talk perhaps. So in summary, we're programmed to cut corners and use shortcuts to minimize our cognitive effort. The good news is that we can be reprogrammed, and we can reprogram ourselves. So that leads now to the topic of KPIs and why that's sometimes the wrong metric. They have a long and illustrious history. I won't go into it too much because you know what KPIs are, number of new contracts, etc. Often they're lagging indicators that we're looking at rather than leading indicators, but can be both. The KPIs have a good history as well in sales, and they've worked very well there. And I know that when I was working communications, we had KPIs, but it didn't make sense for communications. And one of the reasons for this is, for supporting functions, is that you're typically looking at the elimination of risk rather than reward. So some examples might be that were used in communications are adoption rates, engagement of employees, employee feedback, retention and turnover, online interaction and viewership, customer satisfaction and sales, collaboration and innovation. All of these are complex metrics in their own right to measure. In fact, for collaboration, I've got an entire program running to develop something looking at network theory. These are complex metrics. They can be measured, but they're not easy. But what I typically found in my time in communications was the biggest indicator of success was the absence of escalations. And that really got me thinking about what I called at the time KFIs, or key failure indicators, and I later redefined as KRIs, key risk indicators, because that's what I actually found in the literature to be the actual term for what I thought I had invented. So I'll call them KRIs. But in any case, the absence of negative effects is often the metric that you're looking at. So that leads us to that topic of KRIs. And like KPIs, these are measurable. They are looking at the loss resulted from inadequate or failed internal processes, people and systems, or external events. I mean, that's really the heart of it. And if we're in any kind of supporting function, we're going to be looking predominantly at key risk indicators. Like KPIs, they need to be measurable, predictable, comparable, and informational as well. One KRI from the support world has been to delight customers. Our KPI has been to delight customers. But as already over 10 years ago, Harvard Business Review published this article of stop trying to delight your customers, because out of 75,000 people they interviewed, all customers really want is a simple, quick solution to their problem. They're not interested in being delighted. They're not interested in this KPI type mindset. They want the absence of interactions with support. So ultimately, a customer interacting with support at all is a key risk indicator. And this has led us to create a new slogan of minimize effort always. And there's a whole philosophy around that as well, because minimization is a process as compared to outcome biases, where delight is an ephemeral state. Minimizing effort is actually something that it continues forever. It's the process of optimization is continuous. You never actually achieve like a perfect optimization. As the situations change, so too will it. So it's a leading indicator in the sense of being closely connected to operational efficiency, satisfaction, and loyalty. And once you begin to optimize it, it is effectively a KRI in its own right. You can then monitor that and flag it, and as the stats change, then you might need to action it. And the key aspect here is that you need to evaluate your objectives and ask yourself, is it really a KPI, typo there, sorry about that, rather than a KRI? For supporting functions, KRIs may be a much better approach. Oh my goodness, so many typos in that one. Framing failure. So I'm going to frame that typo failure as that was completely intentional, just checking if people are actually still awake. Here's the mysterious case of the efficiency of a new support process. So some time ago, we implemented a new approach for customers to log tickets called the support assistant. And it's effectively a wizard, an incident wizard, if you like, or a case wizard. And in comparison, we have the standard form where you have to fill out all of the individual details, as compared to having a wizard basically ask you at each step of the way and providing you with information along the way that may help to deflect, help you to solve your problem basically. But after a year of it running, there was still no evidence of whether it was really successful or not. And the adoption was flagging, it was lagging basically, and of course adoption had been set as a metric. So in framing this particular situation, I had to really think about, well, what are the fundamental biases that may be at play in this particular project? And they really were overconfidence and outcome bias. So I was looking at ways to de-bias those two in particular. One is to move away from focusing on the outcome of the adoption rates and focus on the process of adoption itself. What leads to adoption? What are the leading indicators of adoption rather than adoption itself? And how might we be overconfident? Of course, we were all convinced that this could be a great tool and could be helpful, but were we overconfident? What was that based on? So the adoption metric had been set at 25% within the 2020 time frame, and there was no real research to sort of back that up at the time. So it would not have been a robust decision, even if we had succeeded or failed. It would not have been based on any actual process in terms of the actual measurement. And an initial review of the observational data showed that the results were mixed in terms of customer time to resolution and the number of component changes and the complexity, etc. So I suggested that we run a randomized control trial, which is a gold standard, if you like, in the medical world. And basically, the Germans have an expression here of Vertrauen is good, control is better, or basically trust is good, control is better. In this case, randomized control is better. Where you A/B test. Effectively, an A/B test is a type of randomized control trial. It's the language used in the business world, but you basically assign it to two separate groups and you randomize it so that you effectively have the statistical equivalent of two identical people that you're running the treatment with. And the reason for RCTs is simple, is that we often base decisions on observational data without knowing whether it's actually causal or not. It's correlational. An example here is my gamification platform that I launched. We had some really good statistics suggesting that the ratio of interactions for those people that use the gamification system, they were twice as active in all of the other systems we were measuring than those that did not use it. And the initial thought might be, well, you see, gamification works. It really does lead to higher levels of activity, but that would have been wrong, because that's not a causal statement we could make, because the groups would have been different. In fact, more likely is, and also subsequent research has shown, that people that tend to use gamification also tend to be more active in general. So it's more about the differences in the groups rather than necessarily the process itself, and that's why you need to randomize. So that's what we did with this particular situation here, is that we ran this, randomized the groups, and then looked at the different effects for each of those. And what we found was that indeed conversion now as a type of deflection, basically a session is logged, it converts to a ticket or it does not convert to a ticket, was markedly different. Is that those using the support assistant in blue on average logged 52% of the time logged a ticket from their session, as compared to 78% of the time from the standard incident form. This was a proper randomized control. The groups were effectively comparable, so it was not based on group differences. And we controlled the difference in products where it ranged. In some cases, it was over 30% higher. In some cases, it was 8 to 10%, but on average, we had this 26% difference. So normally, with a robust approach, you go like, well, let's go celebrate, roll this out, make it mandatory, etc. But we can't, because it raises more questions than it answers in many respects. We couldn't poll the customers because of technology at the time as to why they didn't log a case. And this is also GDPR and data protection, and that's very, very complex. Sometimes it's just difficult to get the information you really need to improve the customer experience. So the reasons for the differences can't be purely inferred from that alone. We know that there is an effect when people have no choice but to use one tool or the other, that they log fewer tickets, but we don't know exactly why. And so that has led to additional research. But what it does is it shows that the decision process, when robust, enables you to make to distance yourself as a decision maker from the results, be they positive or negative, explanatory or not. If you have the transparency to say, I know why this decision has been made, and I can state that, failure is not really so important anymore. You shift yourself away from the outcome bias aspects of the topic. And that really is summarized here, is that we want to move away from looking at our target specifically and shift our focus to the process of what it takes to get there, which can be very, very complex. But by doing that, we effectively liberate ourselves from the anxiety of performance itself. So I'm wrapping up now. I think we'll have time for talk now. SMART plus OKRs. Most of you will have heard of SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely or time-bound. Is that when you think of your objectives, that you really define them in that way. The other aspect is that you should make sure that any objective is closely connected to some top level organizational objectives, and then you use these as leading indicators of that lagging indicator at the highest level. And then OKRs, of course, are objectives and key results have been used as well. Now, this may sound like it's an objective focus again, but when you're looking at the process of making decisions about these objectives, that's the important aspect. You can have metrics and you can have objectives and you can have simplistic numbers. As long as you can clearly and transparently argue for why you've chosen those numbers, then you really can't go wrong. And another point before we wrap it up, one more slide following this, is the illusion of intangibles. People often talk about specific things like employee sentiment and engagement, etc., as being intangible, and that a lot of the really important metrics in a business just can't be captured. But that's an absolute illusion. Anything that exists can be measured, and you can find ways of doing so also with data. Now, while intangibles typically are measured with survey data, you can actually take the equivalent of it and match it to your operational data, and then start to use behaviors as your predictors, as your leading indicators of those so-called intangibles. You'd have to do it on a case-by-case basis, and obviously there's not time in this presentation to do so, but there is a process for taking any intangible, even intention and sentiment, etc., and finding other indicators of it within your data if you're collecting enough behavioral data. And remembering as well that behaviors are a far more powerful indicator than what people say about their behaviors, where you always have the issues of self-report, self-selection biases, and all the other problems that go along with survey methodologies. So to wrap it up, towards meaningful measurement, an initial roadmap is to really ask what you're trying to do. Like really, what are you trying to do with a given project or a given decision? And once you're really clear about that, what does success look like? And don't even think about the lower level metrics, the potential leading indicators of that success. What does success look like? Is it that customers are now recommending you to other customers and you're increasing your overall customer base through that? Whatever it happens to be, you need to know what success really looks like for your project. Once you can really define that, you need to also ask, what does failure look like? And to really, I would highly recommend that you run the equivalent of a pre-mortem, Klein's pre-mortem it's called. It's a very powerful technique for any kind of project management or decision making that you may be engaged with. And then once you've got that, how will you know your efforts led to success? And that's really then developing the indicators of those success metrics and really understanding how you led to those results. Was there a causal link? Or like with the communications examples, we have positively impacted loyalty. Well, how? I have never met a communications professional or consulted the communications department that was doing that robustly and could clearly and causally show how their efforts, their articles, the sentiment of their articles, was directly connected to any top organizational goals. Now, you may not even need that in your business because most people don't actually. But if we strive towards that, we're going to have a lot better metrics in the future. We're going to have a clear understanding and a transparency around the process that leads to the decisions and leads to the definition of those metrics. And that ultimately is going to almost entirely eliminate any anxiety around communicating success or failure within your organization. And on that note, we have a little bit of time left, but it's okay to be wrong if your process is right. Thank you for your time, and I'll hand over to Jose for Q&A.
Sean, how many hours do you have? We have 4 minutes here, but you know, you have opened Pandora's box of
Sorry.
measurement and observation. And with this crowd, I mean, we have like probably hundreds of Lean Six Sigma master black belts in here, and you know, who are just loving everything about what you're talking about. I'm gonna bring my camera on, and I ask that you stop showing your screen, your presentation screen, so that they can see you in the bigger camera right now. And
Yep.
fantastic. So we have reduced time here, and this
I'm
audience is
sorry.
so this audience is so sophisticated that I'm gonna pose every question, but first I'll open with a quote because they provided that with that at first as well. So the first one comes from Edward Deming, and the quote is, "In God we trust, all others bring data." And and tell us, the question comes from William Fuller, and William is saying, based on your analysis of methods for collaborative decision making, would you suggest that type 1 thinking or type 2 thinking is preferable for decision making? From, you know, he's alluding to the book from Daniel Kahneman. I'm sure you know about that. So
Yes.
what is your thoughts about bringing this, what you discuss here, to the framework of type 1 and type 2 thinking?
Yeah, so what I'm trying to do in the organization is to combine the two, is to translate type 2 thinking data into the equivalent of type 1 thinking heuristics and processes. So basically, you want to minimize the effort for your decision makers, but you need a high level of cognition for many decisions, especially in business. So your type 2, your thinking slow processes are necessary to process that data. But what if we can automate the generation of insights? And that's what we're looking at, is how can we build systems that take the complex type 2 thinking system and generate a level of communications design that makes it possible for the decision maker to quickly understand what the problem is through informational architecture, design choice architecture, what it actually looks like, and then they can make that decision very easily with minimal effort and minimal stress. And you have that sort of decision-making matrix, basically, of process goals as well. That's from the adaptive decision maker. I have it cited somewhere else, but basically, adaptive decision maker and process goals are to increase accuracy, increase transparency, or minimize effort and minimize stress for the decision maker, and depending on what that is. But actually, we can do all of them. We can minimize stress and effort for the individual by automating the process of insight generation and then augmenting the individuals with that. So both thinking slow and thinking fast, it's not that one is better than the other. The problem is when they're not used in the correct context, when you should be thinking more about a process, but you're not. And it's not always easy to know how to do that. That's the other problem. So that's why we need technological debiasing. We need to build systems that just make it easy for people to make the right decisions.
Powerful, powerful, powerful insight, Sean. So we have time for maybe one more here. And the quote is from all the way back to the 1930s, a great statistician, Walter Shewhart. And Walter Shewhart likes to talk about, you know, data apart from its context is meaningless. And you talked about this. You talked about the importance of the data, but you also talked about the importance of observing behaviors associated with that data. So if you can discuss a little bit more about that need for measurement, if looked at more broadly, is not just the hard data, but also the behaviors that give you insight on how that data is collected. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's at the heart of automation, really. And that's what this entire conference was about, really. It's digital process automation, but the automation serves the augmentation of the decision maker in my world and in my worldview. We automate in order to augment. And so any automation has to be well thought out to begin with. And the human input, the system 2 thinking has to be there to begin with to make sure that that automation makes sense and that we're simplifying things that humans can't do better. Machines can do certain things better than humans, but humans are better at other things. So we shouldn't waste time trying to improve the human experience in terms of doing something a human can do better, where maybe crowdsourcing might be a better approach, or getting a panel of experts together. You know, we still are the leading species on the planet for a few more years. So the process is absolutely that data alone has no fundamental value until you start to make sense of it and aggregate it. But that is the process of data analysis itself, data science. It's connecting everything to a question and asking yourself, what could the leading indicators be? And this is why randomized control trials are a very, very powerful method to use. And it sounds fancy. Ultimately, it's just A/B testing. If you have a digital platform where you're augmenting your people, you can A/B test everything. And you can then really get a sense of how people are interacting and behaving, using that particular platform, those approaches. I don't know if that really answers the question specifically, but it's kind of implicit.
Those are great insights. That is the type of commentary that we're looking to. Sean, terrific. Time flies when you're having fun, and this thing just kind of blew by us. So what is the best way for those in the audience to follow some of the work, the research that you do? Is there a place we can go that we can, is that LinkedIn, or is there a place where maybe you publish your work and your research?
I mean, I'm working with several universities like London School of Economics and Karlsruhe Institute of Technology and others around running several randomized controls. And because the platform I'm building is one of choice architecture, so it's very much based on Richard Thaler and Sunstein's work in Nudge and his subsequent Nobel Prize winning research, but basically looking at the behavioral aspects. So there will be research published from that as well, but LinkedIn would be the place to go. I will, typically accept whoever from this group at least. If you just say, hey, it was from the conference, then I'll accept you as a contact. And if you have a specific idea you'd like to discuss, then we can continue the conversation through LinkedIn.
Sean, thank you for generosity, for sharing your expertise and insights with our global audience today. We really, really appreciate that.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's a great conference.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Ladies and gentlemen, that is Sean MacNiven, who is the head of strategy and research at SAP, directly from Germany to our global audience. Wonderful insights about measurement, about our intuition, about our biases, and so much more. So thank you for his insights and practical perspectives as well. And we are looking forward to taking a break right now, and when you come back, you're gonna come back with me. And what I'm gonna share with you as the last session for our free day event is the practical lessons for digital process automation from great enduring organizations in our time. Any organization, or at least most organizations, can do a successful automation here and there, accelerate innovation, in fragments. But what does it look like when organizations lead innovation for value creation and have digital process automation as part of that for more than a decade? And not only they continuously improve, they improve exponentially over time. What is the secret? It's not what you see on the media. It's not what you hear from the one-hit wonders, the ones that do an innovation here, a great automation there. How do you build that as a key organizational capability in your organization? It's not easy, but I'm gonna unlock the keys to digital process automation done at the greatest level. We're gonna look at the fundamentals and how great organizations use those fundamentals to accelerate excellence, innovation, and value creation. So I'll see you back at the top of the hour where we're gonna go deeper into that topic. So thank you for now. Enjoy a few minutes break.